Something just happened, and if you're paying close enough attention, you can feel it. Not with your eyes, not with logic, but somewhere deeper, somewhere quieter. The moment you found this, before you even pressed play, before a single word reached your mind, something in you responded. Not to the title, not to the thumbnail, but to a frequency that felt familiar in a way you couldn't explain. That's not coincidence. That's recognition. And recognition like this doesn't happen randomly. It happens when something in your life has reached a point where you're ready to receive what you weren't able to hear before. So just pause for a second. Not in a dramatic way, not in a forced way, just become aware of where you are right now, the room, the air, the weight you've been carrying lately. Because let's be honest, the last few weeks haven't been light, have they? There's been something sitting with you, something you haven't fully named, but you've definitely felt it. Maybe it shows up as overthinking late at night. Maybe it's that quiet pressure in your chest that doesn't go away, even when nothing is technically wrong. Or maybe it's the strange feeling that your life is moving, but you're not entirely sure where it's going anymore. And the confusing part is, from the outside, things might look normal. People around you probably think you're fine. You're still showing up, still doing what needs to be done, still holding everything together in a way that no one questions. But inside, there's been a shift, a subtle one, but undeniable. The version of you from a few months ago doesn't fully exist anymore, and the version you're becoming hasn't completely formed yet. You're somewhere in between, and that in-between space can feel disorienting. Like you're walking through something you don't have the language to explain. But here's what most people misunderstand about this phase. They think something is wrong. They think they're lost or falling behind or somehow not doing life correctly. But what if this feeling, this exact state you're in right now, isn't a mistake? What if it's actually a signal? Because the truth is, there's a certain kind of person who reaches this point. Not everyone does. It's the kind of person who feels things more deeply than they show. The kind of person who notices patterns other people ignore. The kind of person who has tried more than once to fit into a version of life that never quite matched who they really are. And if you're being honest, you've probably questioned yourself because of that. Wondered if you're overthinking, if you're too sensitive, if you're making things more complicated than they need to be. But what if that's not the problem? What if that's actually the indicator? Because people who are completely disconnected from themselves don't ask these questions. They don't feel this tension. They don't notice that something is off. The fact that you do means something in you is active. A level of awareness that hasn't shut down, even when it would have been easier to ignore it. And that awareness, as uncomfortable as it can be, is not there by accident. It's the beginning of something. And this is where it gets interesting, because most people will never stop long enough to recognize this moment. They'll distract themselves, scroll past it, numb it, push it away with noise, with routines, with anything that keeps them from sitting with what they're actually feeling. But you didn't. For whatever reason, you ended up here, listening to this, staying with it. And that choice, even if it felt small, is not insignificant. Because there's a pattern to how certain moments unfold in life. They don't announce themselves loudly. They don't come with clear explanations. They show up quietly, almost invisibly, and only reveal their meaning to the people who are willing to pay attention. And right now, whether you realize it yet or not, you're in one of those moments. There's been something trying to reach you. Not in some dramatic, unrealistic way, but in small, consistent signals that have been showing up in your life. Maybe it's the same thought returning over and over again, even when you try to ignore it. Maybe it's a feeling you can't shake, no matter how much you distract yourself. Or maybe it's the way certain situations keep repeating, like life is trying to get your attention through patterns instead of words. At first, those signals are easy to dismiss. You tell yourself it's nothing. just a phase, just stress, just your mind overanalyzing things again. But then they keep happening, again and again, and at some point it becomes harder to ignore the fact that something is trying to be seen. And that's where you are now, right at the edge of recognizing it, right before it fully makes sense. Because here's the part no one really explains. When your life starts shifting in a meaningful way, it doesn't begin with clarity. It begins with confusion, with discomfort, with the feeling that something is changing, but you don't yet know what it is. And if you misinterpret that feeling, you'll try to escape it. You'll try to go back to what felt stable, even if it wasn't right for you. But if you stay with it, if you actually allow yourself to sit in this space without rushing to fix it, something starts to happen. The noise begins to separate from the signal. The patterns become clearer. The things you've been feeling start to connect in a way they didn't before. And slowly, almost without you noticing, you begin to understand. Not everything at once, not in a way that suddenly solves your entire life, but enough to realize that this moment, this exact phase you're in, has a purpose that goes deeper than you first assumed. And the reason this matters so much is because most people never reach that realization. They exit too early. They label the discomfort as a problem and try to eliminate it before it has a chance to reveal what it's actually pointing toward. They choose certainty over truth, even if that certainty keeps them stuck. But you're still here, still listening, still open, even if you're not fully aware of it yet. And that openness is what changes everything. Because once you reach this point, once you begin to sense that there's more happening beneath the surface of your life, you can't completely go back to not knowing. You can ignore it for a while, you can distract yourself temporarily, but that awareness doesn't disappear. It waits, it continues to surface in different ways until you finally decide to pay attention. And right now, whether you planned it or not, you are paying attention. Which means this isn't random. This isn't just another video, this is a moment. And the real question isn't whether something is trying to reach you anymore. The real question is, are you ready to understand what it's been trying to say? Let me take you a little deeper, because this is where things start to shift from something you feel into something you can actually begin to recognize. Up until now, it's been subtle. A sense, a pressure, a quiet knowing that something isn't quite the same anymore. But there's a structure behind that feeling, even if no one ever explained it to you. To understand it, I want you to imagine someone, not as a distant character, but as a reflection. Someone whose life looks stable on the surface. Someone who shows up every day, does what's expected, says the right things at the right time. Let's call her Mira. Mira had learned how to function perfectly. She knew how to respond, how to adapt, how to keep things smooth. People trusted her. They relied on her. From the outside, everything about her life made sense. But underneath that, there was a constant, quiet exhaustion she couldn't explain. Not physical tiredness, but something deeper. Like she was holding a version of herself in place that didn't fully belong to her anymore. At first, she ignored it. That's what most people do. When something doesn't have a clear explanation, it's easier to push it aside than to question everything around it. So she kept going. Same routines, same conversations, same patterns, but the feeling didn't leave. It grew, it started showing up in small ways. A strange restlessness on certain days for no obvious reason. Moments where everything around her felt slightly distant. Like she was present but not fully connected. And then there were the thoughts. Not loud, not dramatic, just consistent. The same quiet questions returning again and again. Is this really it? Why does something feel off? What am I not seeing? She told herself it was stress, overthinking. Maybe she just needed a break. But the pattern continued, and this is where most people miss what's actually happening. Because these aren't random disruptions, they're signals. Not signals in the way we usually expect, not clear instructions or obvious answers. The kind of signals that matter don't arrive like that. They come as repetition, as patterns that repeat themselves until you can't ignore them anymore. Think about your own life for a second. Has something been repeating lately? A thought, a situation, a feeling that keeps coming back even when you try to move past it? That's not your mind being stuck. That's something trying to get your attention. For Mira, the repetition became impossible to ignore. The same type of conversations, the same emotional responses, the same internal tension. It wasn't chaos, it was consistency. And consistency always points to something. But repetition isn't the only way these signals show up. Sometimes they appear as resistance. And this is where things get misunderstood the most, because when something doesn't work, when a path doesn't open, when effort doesn't lead to the result you expected, the natural reaction is to push harder, to try more, to force it into place. Mira did the same. She tried to fix the feeling by doing more effort, more control, more adjustment. But the more she pushed, the more resistance she felt. Not dramatic failure, just a constant sense that things weren't aligning the way they should. And eventually that resistance started to feel less like an obstacle and more like a message. Because resistance isn't always there to stop you. Sometimes it's there to redirect you. Now think about this in your own life. Is there something you've been pushing toward that just won't fully open? Something that feels like it should work, but doesn't, no matter how much effort you apply? That's not always failure. Sometimes that's protection. Then there's another kind of signal, one that's even quieter but often more accurate than anything else. The moments where you just know something even when you can't explain why. Mira experienced this too. Small instincts she ignored at first. A feeling to step back from certain situations. A sense that something wasn't right, even when everything looked fine. And every time she ignored it, she ended up back in the same place, wondering why things felt off again. That kind of knowing doesn't come from overthinking. It comes before thought. It's fast, immediate, and often inconvenient because it doesn't always align with what you want to be true, but it's consistent. And consistency is what separates noise from signal. Now here's where everything started to change for her. It didn't happen through clarity. It didn't happen because she suddenly figured everything out. It happened through a moment she didn't plan for. Something in her life shifted. A connection that had been stable for years suddenly ended. No warning, no clear explanation that made it easier. Just a sudden absence where something familiar used to be, and in that space something unexpected surfaced. Without the usual distractions, without the pattern she had been maintaining. She was left with herself, not the version she presented to the world, but the one underneath it. The one she had been slowly disconnecting from without realizing it. And for the first time in a long time, things became clear in a way that didn't require overthinking. Not because everything made sense, but because the signal was finally louder than the noise. This is what most people don't realize about moments like that. They see them as disruptions, as things going wrong, as losses that shouldn't have happened. But sometimes those moments are the only way the signal can break through. Because as long as everything feels stable, you don't question it. And if you don't question it, you don't change it. Now, this isn't just about one person. This is a pattern, a structure that shows up in different forms, but always follows the same logic. Signals come in layers. First, they're subtle, easy to ignore. Then they repeat, harder to dismiss. Then they create resistance, forcing your attention. And if none of that works, they arrive as change. Not because something is going wrong, but because something is trying to realign. So when you look at your life right now, instead of asking, why is this happening? Try asking a different question. What is this pointing me toward? Because the answer is never random. It's always connected to something deeper, something that has been building long before you became consciously aware of it. And the moment you start looking at your experiences through that lens, everything begins to organize itself differently. The confusion doesn't disappear instantly, but it starts to make sense in a way it didn't before. You begin to see patterns where you once saw problems. You begin to recognize direction where you once felt lost. And most importantly, you begin to understand that what's happening to you is not separate from you. It's part of a conversation. One that has been happening the entire time. You just weren't taught how to hear it. And this is where everything starts to come together in a way that feels less like theory and more like recognition. Because once you begin to see the patterns, once you start noticing how life has been speaking through repetition, resistance, intuition, and unexpected change, something subtle but powerful begins to happen inside you. You stop seeing your life as random events happening to you, and you start sensing a kind of structure underneath it all. Not a rigid structure, not something that controls you, but something that responds to you. And in that realization, there is a quiet shift in identity. Because if your life has been communicating with you all along, then you are not separate from it. You are part of the same system that is producing the signals. And that means something very important. It means you are not lost. You are not disconnected. You are not behind. You are in the middle of a conversation that has been unfolding in real time, and you are only now beginning to hear it clearly. But there's something even deeper than that, because the real message underneath all of this isn't just that life is speaking to you. It's that you have a frequency, not in a metaphorical, poetic sense only, but in the sense that your emotional patterns, your attention, your inner state, the way you consistently show up internally, all of that creates a kind of signal, a consistency, a pattern that interacts with everything around you. And that is why certain things keep showing up in your life. Not because you are attracting them in a simplistic way, but because you are already in relationship with them through your state of being. Your internal world is not isolated. It is part of the same field that responds to you through experiences, people, timing, and change. This is where the idea of the universe trying to tell you something becomes more precise. It is not speaking in sentences, it is responding in alignment, and alignment is always informational. Which means every repeated situation, every emotional pattern, every moment of resistance is not random. It is directional. It is pointing toward the same thing over and over again until it becomes clear enough for you to see. And here is where most people miss the turning point. They think the message is outside of them, but the message is actually about them. Not as a judgment, not as something to fix, but as something to recognize. Because the version of you that is confused, the version that feels stuck, the version that keeps encountering the same patterns, that version is not wrong. It is simply operating at a level where the signal is still being translated through emotion instead of understanding. And that is where awareness changes everything. Because the moment you start observing instead of reacting, something inside you begins to separate. You are no longer fully inside the pattern. You are watching it. And in that space of observation, even if it is small at first, clarity begins to form. You start noticing that certain emotional reactions are not new, they are familiar. They have been here before, just in different situations, different people, different timelines, but the feeling is the same, and that is one of the clearest signs that something deeper is being expressed through your experience, because life rarely repeats itself in content. It repeats itself in themes, and themes are how meaning becomes visible. Now, when you reach this level of awareness, something very important starts to happen internally. You begin to feel a kind of responsibility, not pressure, not obligation, but awareness that you are participating in your experience more than you realized, that your attention is not passive, that your inner state is not irrelevant, that what you repeatedly hold inside you becomes the filter through which everything else is interpreted, and that realization can feel uncomfortable at first, because it removes the illusion that everything is purely external. But at the same time, it opens something else entirely. Because if your internal state plays a role in what you experience, then you are not powerless. You are not stuck waiting for life to change before you can change. You are already part of the mechanism that shapes how life is being experienced, and this is where the idea of frequency becomes practical instead of abstract. Your frequency is not something mystical floating outside of you. It is your default way of being, your habitual thoughts, your emotional baseline. The tone of your attention when nothing is trying to impress you or distract you. And that baseline matters more than most people realize, because life responds less to what you want occasionally and more to what you are consistently. Not as punishment, not as reward, but as resonance. Which means when your internal state is scattered, unclear, or constantly shifting between resistance and hope, your external experience reflects that instability in its own way. Not to punish you, but to mirror coherence back to you. And when your internal state becomes more stable, more honest, more aligned with what is actually true for you, rather than what you are trying to force, something begins to reorganize, not instantly, not dramatically, but consistently. This is why moments of breakdown often precede moments of clarity, because breakdown removes noise. It removes what was not stable. It removes what was maintained through effort rather than alignment. And in that removal, something more authentic becomes visible. This is also why resistance is so important. Because resistance is not just an obstacle. It is feedback. It shows you where force is replacing alignment. It shows you where effort is being used instead of clarity. It shows you where something is being pushed that is not naturally supported by your current state of being. And if you listen to that feedback instead of fighting it, your direction changes. Not because you gave up, but because you understood, and understanding always reduces unnecessary struggle. Now, at this point, something very subtle becomes available to you. You start to notice that life is not random and you are not separate from it, and your experience is not happening outside of your participation. You are inside a feedback loop, a living one that reflects your internal state back to you through external experience. And once you see that clearly, even just once, it is very difficult to fully unsee it again. Because now you are aware that meaning is not only something you discover, it is something that is continuously formed through your attention, which means every moment becomes slightly more intentional, even without forcing it. You start to listen differently. You start to observe differently. You start to pause before reacting, even if just for a second, and in that second, something new becomes possible. Not a different life immediately, but a different relationship to the life you already have. And that is where the real shift begins. Because the universe is not trying to overwhelm you with messages. It is trying to bring you into coherence with yourself. And when that coherence begins to form, even in small ways, everything that is not aligned starts to lose its grip naturally. Not through struggle, but through recognition. And that recognition is the beginning of clarity. Not because everything becomes easy, but because you finally understand what you are looking at. And from that understanding, your next step is no longer confusion. It becomes response. And that is the point where you are no longer just receiving signal. You are participating in them.